I'm with an old friend of mine, Richard Wells. Yeah, we both have been in the ACT Party for a little while and done we both sit on the fringes to some extent. What's your involvement now?
Yeah, I'm still a member of the party, so still supporting them to some degree, but I don't have any. I spend a little bit of time on the board and on the regional council, but I'm no longer involved at that level and don't currently have any active engagement with the party.
So what do you think about... one of the major points, you and I have just had a cup of tea and we talked about freedom of speech, and what both of us enjoy now is the fact that we can say what we think and say what we believe, and without any having to follow a party line or follow anything else. And I think that's quite a comfortable place to be, but not really.
Yeah, well, I think, Max, the reason that we had the conversation we had over coffee and tea is because, A, we've known each other for a while, so we're quite comfortable having any conversation on any topic. We've certainly had conversations, as you will no doubt recall, where we don't agree with each other, but they're all very civil conversations, and we enjoy those and use them as an opportunity to learn. And because we've got that comfortable rapport, we can have that conversation, and that's how those conversations should be. What concerns me, though, is that that's not necessarily the case when you're now no longer in a situation where you're talking to someone that, particularly people you don't know. And the last few years have brought about an environment where there are certain topics that all of a sudden you're nervous to speak about. And, the government obviously looking at things like hate speech laws, for example, which will involve difficult definitions of what is and isn't hate speech. And so, my theory would be, let's just not go there. We've got our laws that say you can't incite to violence. That's a good yardstick. We've got the laws on the books we need to prevent that kind of discussion. Other speech should be free for people to speak out on.
Richard, wouldn't you have said that was been around for a long time? We all lowered our voices if we thought something was going to offend someone else in the room?
Yeah. Well, you might lower your voice, but I think the nature...
And that word, that common thing, little white lies... us Kiwis are the worst for it, but, we always tell people what they want to hear, and that makes them sort of like you more, and that's what we like. You go to Australia, we call them crass, because they'll tell you to your face what they think.
Right. Yeah, but I think what's happened over the last couple of years now, though, is that it's really got to the point where even those little white lies now, they just become silence. And there are topics that, if you talk about, the big ones obviously are the COVID mandates and lockdowns and things like that. And it just became difficult to voice what shouldn't be a radical opinion, right? So you look at lockdowns. Mm-hmm. Some people would be saying they were necessary and they were a good thing.
Well, I'll tell you, the hot one right now is co-governance. You'll find a lot of people won't talk publicly about that at all.
It's great, because as soon as you come out and say, oh, I'm not sure, Three Waters, they're essentially taking control of those assets that ratepayers paid for, all of a sudden you're a racist. And the comment I just made didn't mention anything about race. And if you go look at it, they are in fact taking control of those assets. What I'm just pointing it out. I didn't mention anything about race, but that's where current governments have driven us, and they're driving the conversation to that kind of divisiveness. And I guess portions of the population just going along with it, and it's easier to be quiet.
So do you think it's racked up since, I don't know what era you come from, but I came around from the 60s and 70s where there was a degree of it, but not to the degree I've noticed, a radical movement in this way. Do you think it's increased in recent times?
Absolutely. It's probably been creeping ever since, I'm more of the 70s and 80s. And
do you think it's political, or do you think it's actually in our population and with the generation change perhaps? This generation actually are more stronger about, hey, don't say anything that'll offend me.
Well, I guess over time you've seen this, what we call it, the perpetually offended type of people. And I guess over time you've seen a growth in that, and that's been going on for a long time now. But I think maybe it's just reached a threshold with the generation, as you say.
Do you think it's associated also with mental illness has picked up enormously since I was a little boy? Today, it's as prevalent as anything. There were around in my days, but very, very few people had mental illness, whereas today, what is it, 1 in 5? maybe more.
Oh, I think there's something about 1 in 5 kids or something are struggling with it at schools and things like that. I don't recall the numbers. It's not
But
something
do you think
I
this
studied.
is something to do with it, though? Do you think do you think it's genuine, or do you think it's actually fabricated? Some of the I get offended, so don't talk to me like that.
Well, if you go around taking offensive language out of, or the ability to offend people, shall we say, the freedom to offend others. If you go around taking that out of our societies and our schools altogether, you try to ban that because it's offensive and it hurts people. If you try to do that, you ultimately create people who don't get offended, and when they do, they don't know how to handle it. And I can imagine, I don't know for sure, but I can imagine that if people are going through life suddenly being told that if you've been offended, then maybe you need some comforting instead of just, you don't want to say people just should suck this up all the time. But, in our day, if I got called nasty names and I was upset, that was no big deal to, you just move
Sticks
on.
and stones.
Yeah, sticks and stones. Yeah, just get on with it. And have we gone to the point where so many people now are not aware of how to deal with just being offended?
Well,
And
to
could
me,
that
I
create-
used to think, this is quite, 10 years ago, that perhaps people are oversensitized and using it to weaponize their issues. And I think that does go on a little bit today. But what I have noticed, and you have to confirm with this, is that the suicide rates lifted immensely. And they are young people that can't handle criticism, and people who do take it to heart. So really, that's not good for our society, and that is a problem. And in New Zealand, statistics are worse than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, well, I think we like to promote ourselves as this, clean, green, happy country, and I struggle with that notion, because in a clean, green, happy country, or any country that was happy for that matter, you wouldn't have youth suicide rates at that levels. And the fact that they're there suggests a deeper underlying problem, but I can't confirm that. I'm not an expert in that field. I just...
Do you know what is concerning though, Richard? Because I do an employment law, and in my world, if an employee says, hey, I've got some mental illness problems, and we need to confront them about poor performance, for example, and it really often happens, they go hand in hand. How do you go about it without causing mental harm to that person, or exhilarating their mental harm problems to the point where they're not going to cope? And I've got to manage that through by giving advice to employers. And that's why I'm more acutely aware than most, I think, because I see it in society happening every day.
So you've been in that field for quite a while. How did they used to handle that?
Well, it was brutality in the old days. I can recall being an apprentice, and by God, I got my feelings hurt many times by the senior mechanic.
And so if we look back, I don't know, what were the incidents of mental health issues in the workplace?
Very small.
Very small. So I don't know, is that the answer? I wouldn't say let's just be brutal to everyone.
You're turning the interview onto me now, but I do think resilience is very important. The Queen died today, and we've got to acknowledge her, I think, within here. So, and what a stoic, wonderful woman.
Well, there's a resilient lady for you, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point I want to make, is that you never heard her say, I've got it tough. You never heard her ask for sympathy. Even in wartime, she's had a stiff upper lip, and she really was strong. And what she cared about was everyone else rather than herself. I just think there was wonderful attributes that woman displayed right through her life.
Yeah, and the leadership, the qualities that she had are probably closer to what I would consider leadership qualities than anything you see out of modern politicians. And if you look at the modern political class, we don't have anyone who fits in that type of genre.
Well, I think there's a few out there, but
I don't know who they are. So.
You got to say she's been wonderful in that sort of era, and she came from that. I mean, I can remember my dad came back from war, and I think he was probably a more mellow and considerate father than his father was to him. And yet some would say my dad was quite, harsh in many ways, because, I don't remember getting a hug by him or a cuddle from a dad, but he was one of the men I loved and admired in my life.
Yeah, and I think people of our age...
and you couldn't say the word love to Dad. It's not in the vocabulary. You
Right.
don't talk about that.
Right. So, but I think people of our age probably have similar thoughts of our fathers, like you. My father is, he's one of those staunch men who believed in getting up, going to work. I think he worked for probably like 40 years before he took a day off sick or something like that, and took responsibility for his family, and he was resilient. But he was raised in post-war times. Things were tough, and that builds a certain resilience in you. And people of that generation had that resilience. Maybe to some degree they've handed some of that to us because we saw it in them, but it comes down in degrees perhaps. And now as we hand over to our children, the next generation, maybe it's going down by degrees again. And it's, you've got certain people in politics who are almost pushing for not needing resilience. They're so over the top with this idea of you can't offend anyone, you can't let anyone get hurt. Let's not have winners in races, let's have participation awards and all this kind of thing. And the harsh reality is if you go down that track, you are not teaching kids what the real world will be like. And that's what it will be like.
In our discussion, in our private discussion we were having a cup of tea, you made a point which I thought was very, very valid. Generations, decades and decades of looking after our children too well and making sure they weren't injured and weren't offended, all those things. You can't turn that round within a couple of years. And that's your statement, Richard. I just borrowed it, but it's very, very true.
Well,
what's the answer to all this?
Well, Max, I have no idea.
Of course you have.
So, well,
you've got all the answers. I came to you for the answers.
Oh, right, okay. The answers to these, I don't think...
You can't handle the truth. I just thought that line better drop in there somewhere.
Well, fair enough, yeah. Well, the answers will come in the fact that, as you said, or as I said, you can't fix it overnight. And we've spent a long time, growing period of time over multiple generations, mollycoddling kids more and more, us more than our parents and our kids more than us. And at some point in time, you have to turn that around. But you're not going to be able to turn it around overnight. It's going to take a period of time. And you then, this is seen, the most stark area where you can see it is in the beneficiary area that we've got, social welfare.
The next guy who's coming in here, he's been out training Maori businesses in the ability to be resilient. Now, I'm fascinated. I don't know his answers. I don't know what he's doing to train the people. Well, I don't know what he's saying. But maybe, if there is some remedies on teaching people how to become resilient so they can take criticism, they can take opposite point of view without it becoming personalised and offensive. I think that would be a powerful, a lot better, make a better society for us. Wouldn't you agree?
It would be very powerful, but it has to come from a position of respect and authority. And as soon as you say the word respect, you're coming from the government's kind of out because, not a lot of respect for them. But if you've got, in the case of Māori businesses, if you've got someone who's in leadership roles in Māori businesses, setting an example, leading by example, and taking the time to guide those businesses, they can learn that resilience. And then they can teach it a little bit more to the next generation of businesses. And that whether that's in a family, whether if I decide I've mollycoddled my son a bit much and decide to start getting a little bit harsher with him, that's one step. But then he's got to learn and take it down. And that's why I think it's these problems have happened over decades, and we're not going to solve them overnight.
I look, this is another subject, so I'm not going to hold you here forever. But last night I was so upset when I heard on the television, they were talking about the Ram Raiders and how children are doing them. And this guy got on the screen very, very upset. He said it's education. It's all their fault. They have actually created this problem within our children. And I'm thinking, when is anyone ever going to say the parents should take some accountability and responsibility for bringing their own children up? But no, it's always back to the schools and the teachers. Now, I know you've got a passion about this and you've got a lot of thoughts, I guarantee, rushing through your head.
Well,
Shall we call it quits now, or you're just too tempted? You want to?
we'll just finish on this topic. I won't go on about it.
I'm getting back, folks. I can tell now.
But there's a lot of talk on getting tough on these young, you call them criminals, whatever you want to call them, these young ram raiders. And there's probably a place for making sure they understand consequences. And how we do that, I don't have all the answers for that, but we have to teach them consequences, so there have to be consequences. But some of these kids are as young as 11 or 12 years old. I don't know that chucking them in prison is the right answer, but there has to be some form of consequence to them. And ultimately, how do you then turn to their parents? And on the one hand, do you hold them completely accountable? I always thought that that's what we actually did do with these, but we're not. There have to be consequences for the parents too, but it's that in and of itself, I don't think will solve the problem.
Here we go, folks. I've got plenty I can respond back and get you back, but come back again.
Yeah. Look, happy to come back and have a casual chat, Max.
Well, let's continue this subject next time you come back. We're
make a
talk.
note of it, and we'll.
I'm going to push back on some of that stuff you just said about education. But okay.
All right.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Max.